substance I am referring to is fluoride in the public water supply. Many will be quick to assume that anyone who thinks this could be a problem for our health is a nut, a quack, and a conspiracy theorist.
Here are the facts.
Fresh out of UPenn School of Dental Medicine in 1901, Massachusetts native Dr. McKay moved to Colorado Springs to practice dentistry. Upon arrival, he noticed the Colorado Springs locals had disgusting brown stains on their teeth, something he had not seen on the East Coast. These stains were permanent and severe, with some residents' teeth looking as if they had been covered in chocolate candy. But eventually, McKay garnered attention from local dentists of what became known as the Colorado brown stain. He moved to St. Louis, Missouri in 1905 to study orthodontistry, and again noticed the same brown stained teeth in the locals. The condition was blatantly prominent in every group of children. He felt as though the Colorado brown stain was a serious deformity these children were stuck with for life. He found that, despite the residents having grotesque teeth in appearance, these teeth were incredibly resistant to decay. McKay began to theorize that something in the water supply was staining residents' teeth brown, but the mystery was still a long way from being unraveled. Next, McKay and Dr. Grover Kempf of the United States Public Health Service traveled to Bauxite, Arkansas to investigate more reports of the brown stain. Bauxite was a company town supporting the Aluminum Company of America. Remember the Public Health Service and the Aluminum Company of America because they will be important to the story later on. Upon investigation, the children of Bauxite had the disordered teeth, but the children of neighboring towns did not. The two doctors investigated the water supplies, but again, found nothing peculiar. McKay and Kempf filed a report of their findings, which reached the chief chemist of that aluminum company, H.V. Churchill. Churchill was concurrently trying to dispute claims that aluminum cookware was toxic. He became worried that the happenings in Bauxite would give his opponents more ammo to prove that aluminum was poisonous. Churchill decided to head over to Bauxite and test the water using photospectrographic analysis, a method more sophisticated than McKay's. Churchill's assistant conducted the test of Bauxite's water and found that it had high levels of fluoride. Churchill said to his assistant, "Whoever heard of fluorides in the water? You have contaminated the sample. Rush another specimen." His assistant obliged and did another assay of the water, and again found that it had been contaminated with high levels of fluoride. In 1931, Churchill wrote a 5-page letter to McKay detailing his findings of fluoridated water and instructed McKay to collect samples from towns experiencing the notorious brown stain. High levels of fluoride in water supplies indeed caused the discoloration of tooth enamel, now referred to as fluorosis. Before this time, it had been known that fluoride was one of the most toxic compounds in Earth's crust. It was also a byproduct of many industrial processes, most notably the production of aluminum. By the 1920s and 30s, it was the subject of multiple regulations and lawsuits. This became very consequential in 1938 because of the aluminum industry's importance due to the Second World War. Also in 1931, the Public Health Service sent dentist H. Trendley Dean to the West to study the effects of fluoridation on people's teeth. He found that towns with higher amounts of natural fluoride in the water had citizens with fewer cavities. He also found that these people's teeth were often discolored and eroded, but I guess that's neither here nor there. The Mellon Institute, the Aluminum Corporation of America's research lab in Pittsburgh, commissioned Gerald J. Cox to conduct a study. He fluoridated his lab rats' drinking water and pretty much just decided that their cavities had been reduced. He rushed to conclude that this was proof of fluoride preventing cavities. Although fluoride was found to prevent cavities, the general consensus at the time was that fluoride was a poison. In 1936, the Journal of the American Dental Association stated, "Fluoride at the 1 part per million concentration is as toxic as arsenic and lead. There is an increasing volume of evidence of the injurious effects of fluorine, especially the chronic intoxication resulting from the ingestion of minute amounts of fluorine over long periods of time." In 1939, Cox, who had been getting paid by an aluminum company facing fluoride lawsuits, came out publicly to propose mandatory water fluoridation. Other bought and paid for scientists did the same. Researchers sought to put enough fluoride in the water where tooth decay would be prevented, but fluorosis would not occur. With more accurate ways to measure fluoride concentrations, it was determined that water fluoride content of less than 1 parts per million was enough to prevent tooth decay, but not enough to cause severe fluorosis in most people. This determination was later proved wrong when the CDC analyzed the teeth of the nation's teens and found that 40% of them had some degree of dental fluorosis with cloudy spots, streaks, and even brown teeth and tooth erosions. Interestingly, much of this data had come from places with naturally fluoridated water in the form of calcium fluoride. The manufacturing byproduct that gets dumped into water supplies is sodium fluoride. The metal that binds fluoride is a key determinant of its chemical and biological properties. So to extrapolate that sodium fluoride would have the same effects seems like a convenient oversight. We can also look at the work of Weston A. Price, a pioneer of dental research who became famous for his work in the 1930s. In his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, he details the experiences of people who transitioned from more traditional diets to industrialized ones. Notably, even without Western dentistry, societies on their ancestral diets suffered very few cavities. Price mainly attributed this to what he called the displacing foods of modern commerce: white sugar, white flour, and vegetable oil. These foods took up space in the diet where nutrient-dense whole foods would normally be, specifically those rich in fat-soluble vitamins. During World War II, fluoride lawsuits piled up, and the Journal of the American Medical Association came out and said, "Fluorides are general protoplasmic poisons, changing the permeability of the cell membrane by certain enzymes."
Here's where it gets crazy.
Over the coming years, the Public Health Service would adopt an extremely pro-fluoridation stance. The Public Health Service was under the jurisdiction of the Treasury Department. The Treasury Secretary at the time was none other than billionaire Andrew Mellon. Mellon was the founder of the Aluminum Corporation of America, the biggest firm in the aluminum industry. In 1947, President Truman appointed Oscar R. Ewing as the head of the Federal Security Agency, which encompassed the Public Health Service. Ewing and the Public Health Service launched the push for mandatory fluoridation and mobilized establishment groups of dentists and doctors. Ewing's goal was to unite the establishment center and the respectable left to advocate against the right-wing anti-fluoridation kooks, such as the John Birch Society, which was outspoken on the matter. To manage the public relations for this campaign, he hired none other than the father of public relations, Edward Bernays. Here comes some more insanity. Before Ewing arrived in Washington, he was the longtime legal counsel and at the time chief legal counsel of the Aluminum Corporation of America. His legal efforts for the company were earning him $750,000 per year, or the equivalent of just under $11 million in today's money. We could make an entire video on Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, as he changed marketing forever by transforming the public's opinions on topics instead of just trying to sell products. Bernays is quoted saying, "Large numbers of persons will follow the advice of their doctors because he, the PR man, understands the psychological relationship of dependence of man on their physician." The offenders were the Reynolds Metals Company and the notorious Aluminum Company of America. The Mohawk cattle were so ridden with bone disease that they couldn't even stand up and had to crawl along the pastures like snails. Many of them couldn't even graze as their teeth had crumbled to the nerves and they were forced to starve. Birds and bees fled the area, and crops and trees couldn't survive. The fish were ulcerated with spinal deformities, and worst of all, Mohawk children had damaged bones and teeth. The Mohawk tribe sued the two aluminum companies for $150 million, but after 5 years, only ended up with a $650,000 settlement.
In all my years at EPA, I've never seen any instance where politics has gotten more in the way of good science being applied to public health than in the case of fluoride.
It was a foolish thing to do years ago. They didn't have enough information. They hadn't really been tested.
Oh, it would be very difficult for NIH or public health to admit a mistake. We've essentially been exposing people in this country for years. And the situation may be that we, in fact, may have been causing many health problems that we are having to put up with today.
Unfortunately, the attacks on those questioning the safety of fluoridated water are not limited to the average Joe. Even top academics publishing in esteemed medical journals recognize that the topic has become politicized and are effectively being censored by their peers. One paper examining the controversial topic came out in early 2020, titled "The Evolving Science of Fluoride: When New Evidence Doesn't Conform with Existing Beliefs." The authors state, "Over the past 75 years, health authorities have declared that community water fluoridation, a practice that reaches over 400 million worldwide, is safe. Yet, studies conducted in North America examining the safety of fluoride exposure in pregnancy were non-existent. The tendency to ignore new evidence that does not conform to widespread beliefs impedes the response to early warnings about fluoride as a potential developmental neurotoxin. People who question the safety of water fluoridation are quickly dismissed as zealots or anti-science fanatics. Indeed, some scientists dismissed our funding application with comments such as, 'This study is not needed. We know that fluoride is safe.' But we forged ahead. Shouldn't claims about safety be based on evidence? We expected our study would reignite the debate about the safety of water fluoridation, but we didn't expect we would be at the crossfire of this political and polarized debate. Vitriolic comments and claims with little scientific basis, such as the results are driven by outliers, were made by the American Council on Science and Health and the UK-based Science Media Center, both heavily funded by the pharmaceutical and food and beverage industries. We presented our findings at an international meeting held in Ottawa. We were nervous about how the results would be received by the audience, which included members from Health Canada and other public health agencies. Afterwards, someone approached me and said, "Congratulations, you've just sabotaged your career before it even started." It is abundantly clear that water fluoridation is a golden child of industry, government, and academia, an unquestionable fixture in modern public health resembling a religion. It's important to keep this in mind when discussing the topic. The powers that be are actively censoring and dismissing information suggesting it might be harmful. After all, they kind of have to. What are they going to say to people? "Oh yeah, that fluoride we've been dumping into the water the last half century that we said was safe, turns out it's a toxin. Sorry guys." With all that being said, let's get into how ingesting fluoride can potentially be a hazard. The reason water is fluoridated to begin with is so that it can accumulate in your tissues, specifically your bones and teeth, which the public health authorities will happily admit and tout as a good thing. What they won't tell you is that the buildup of fluoride in these tissues also results in higher release of fluoride into the blood, meaning the rest of the body gets proportionally exposed to it. They also won't tell you that it can build up in various other organs, most notably the brain. The developing fetus is particularly susceptible to fluoride accumulation in the brain, likely due to the still developing blood-brain barrier. However, even adults growing up in areas of endemic fluorosis have shown fluoride accumulation in cerebrospinal fluid, indicating that it can indeed cross the barrier with enough exposure. By the way, the most recent data in the United States showed evidence of fluorosis in a staggering 70% of children and adolescents. Of course, fluoride also accumulates in the pineal gland of the brain, but we'll get to that momentarily. Knowing this, the argument that, oh, it's just a little bit of fluoride is completely irrelevant because it's not a one and done dose. The more fluoride you are exposed to, regardless of the dose, the more it builds up in your body. It is a cumulative poison. In health, our energy production is sophisticated and efficient, which supports our structure and vice versa. When one of these becomes compromised, it results in the familiar phenomena of disease and aging. This is particularly important in our most energy and structure dependent organ, the organ that makes us humans more complex than other species, our brains. Energy production supports structure, and our ability to produce energy and maintain structure in the brain leads to our complexity, and the interference of these processes are degeneration. One such example is that of Alzheimer's disease. It's become popular as of late to call it type 3 diabetes, since it's primarily a problem of insufficient glucose metabolism in the brain that leads to degeneration. However, the reduction in metabolism and eventually atrophy primarily strikes the neocortex regions, those responsible for higher thinking, while the inner regions are preserved. Unfortunately, as the disease progresses, people not only lose their memory, but tend to lose many of the traits we associate with humanity, like speech and the ability to learn. Interestingly, fluoride administration has several effects that could do the same. Fluoride is able to disrupt energy production at the mitochondrial level, as it can inhibit several of the enzymes necessary for metabolism. Several reports have indicated that fluoride can induce inflammatory degenerative changes in the cerebral cortex, specifically to the cells that help regulate the metabolism of neurons. Speaking of Alzheimer's disease, fluoride also tends to cause these changes in the hippocampus, the brain region primarily responsible for memory. Others have shown that the mitochondria of the neurons in the cortex begin to abnormally concentrate in the soma and even fragment, thus becoming less able to produce energy. Mitochondria also become less efficient, producing more waste in the form of free radicals, which leads to oxidative stress. This damages the mitochondria, further perpetuating the cycle. Whenever there is oxidative stress, regardless of the culprit, inflammation tends to be right there with it in lockstep, and fluoride is no exception. A recent review of the literature describes fluoride as an endocrine disruptor of several central hormonal systems in the body. They note that these key actions of oxidative stress and inflammation tend to damage the organs and glands responsible for pumping out these chemical messengers. Above all, in terms of importance and its research as it pertains to fluoride, is the thyroid gland. The thyroid is the master regulator of energy utilization throughout the body, and the impairment in thyroid hormone metabolism plays a role in just about any health problem you can think of. They argue that fluoride inhibits thyroid function, as several studies have further supported this notion. One study showed a dose-dependent increase in TSH levels, a precursor thyroid hormone that when elevated indicates a problem with the thyroid gland. This makes sense given what we know about fluoride metabolism in the thyroid. To make its hormones, the thyroid gland requires the micronutrient iodide. However, since fluoride comes from the same family of elements, but it is smaller and more reactive, it tends to displace iodide, thereby impeding the gland's ability to synthesize its hormones. A lack of thyroid hormone metabolism is also a known risk factor for lower intelligence. Of course, the oxidative stress and inflammation induced by fluoride directly damage the thyroid as well, and these changes are ubiquitous when it comes to cognitive abnormalities. For example, one study showed that fluoride can induce depression in animals, and that administering an antioxidant, which doubles as an anti-inflammatory, was able to reverse these changes. Fluoride caused a drop in the energy production of this higher thinking brain region, the cortex, and also led to the death of the cells that make it up. Another study showed a decrease in proteins responsible for neuron-to-neuron communication, again in the cerebral cortex. One of these proteins is known as SYP, and its mutation is known to cause intellectual disability. This leads us down the most controversial and alarming part of fluoride research. Let's begin with the pineal gland. Many ancient civilizations believed the pineal gland to be responsible for consciousness and deeper thinking, claiming it was our metaphorical third eye. Today, it's understood that the pineal gland primarily produces melatonin, which is both important for sleep and has many neuroprotective, anti-inflammatory, and antioxidant properties. Oh yeah, it also produces DMT.
It's all that pineal gland shit is not proven. They don't know that DMT comes in.
I can't handle any more.
They
do now. Yeah, they do now.
Really?
The Cottonwood Research Foundation, they did a series of tests with rats, and they proved that live rats have DMT produced by the pineal gland.
Really?
Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that humans do too, but they're pretty sure they do.
Did you like?
They also know that your lungs produce it and your liver produces it. That's a fact.
Really?
So your body's producing DMT, 100%.
Fluoride is well known to calcify the pineal gland, a degenerative change in this brain region which inhibits its ability to produce the protective melatonin from its precursor, serotonin. It's also been shown that fluoride administration to animals increases serotonin levels, and the same is observed in humans exposed to water fluoridation. Be sure to check out our video on the wonders of serotonin if you're curious on this topic. Serotonin decreases energy production in the brain. This tends to cause lethargy and brain fog,
whereas serotonin's opposing neurotransmitter, dopamine, produces motivation and energy. Of course, having less melatonin and more serotonin also results in worse sleep, which is associated with fluoride exposure. Pineal gland dysfunction resulting in low melatonin, sleep disturbances, low dopamine, and high serotonin is related to multiple mental disorders such as ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and Alzheimer's disease. One study looked at fluoride concentrations in Scotland in relation to Alzheimer's disease and found that those consuming the most had nearly 3 times the risk of developing this kind of dementia. This was a far higher risk than even that of aluminum. You know what the worst part is? Scotland doesn't even fluoridate their water. This was just comparing the trace amounts found in the water, which was, are you ready for this? Less than 5% the concentration that even the WHO recommends. Even crazier is that they adjusted for childhood IQ, so the effect is probably worse given what we will address shortly. The authors concluded by stating, "This suggests that there may be no safe levels of these substances when it comes to dementia risk." The plot thickens when it comes to ADHD. It's commonly said that it is a condition of dopamine dysfunction, and given that fluoride is known to decrease dopamine and increase serotonin, it's a plausible candidate as a cause. Animal studies repeatedly show accumulation of fluoride in the brain, again at concentrations in the blood similar to what many people experience who drink fluoridated water. Animals who achieved this level of fluoride in the blood experienced significant cognitive changes, but the specific type of effect was determined by the time of exposure. Animals whose mothers were exposed to fluoride in the womb exhibited hyperactive traits, while animals drinking fluoride after being born were characterized as having cognitive deficits. ADD and ADHD seem to parallel the two behaviors of the animals given fluoride. Perhaps unsurprisingly, these conditions were relatively rare prior to widespread water and product fluoridation in the 40s and 50s. One study found a tight correlation between water fluoridation prevalence with ADHD diagnoses. The prevalence of ADHD has continued to rise over the years, so in order to control for a potential time effect, the analysis was done in 3 separate years, each 4 years apart. While the ADHD prevalence did increase over the years, regardless of fluoride, the fluoride prevalence within each year was still highly predictive of ADHD. Another study in humans is even more alarming. Subjects were given 0, 1, 100, or 500 parts per million of fluoride sublingually and tested for cognitive function thereafter. I'll let the authors be the judge. Subjects who received concentrated doses of fluoride appear to suffer from what might be termed tunnel vision, paying more attention to the lights on the left of their visual field. They know that this was a dose-dependent response, more fluoride, worse performance. After hypothesizing a few mechanisms at play, they go on to state, again, all of this is speculation. What is not speculation is the fact that 2 chemicals found in municipal waters, sodium fluoride and nitrate, produce reliable changes in sensory motor performance. It is worth noting that individuals also absorb fluoride when they brush their teeth. Well, that's okay, because they gave people an insane 500 parts per million of fluoride, whereas the amount in most toothpastes is only 1,000 to 1,500 parts per million. Animal studies have consistently shown impaired learning, cognition, and memory when exposed to fluoride. This brings us to the most widely discussed issue when discussing water fluoridation, its effect on IQ. Now, I'm of the belief that it's impossible to judge someone's intelligence solely off of these exams, and they shouldn't be taken as gospel as some would like. However, on a population level, it should give us a pretty good proxy for cognitive function. Multiple studies have examined the difference in IQ scores for developing children, and the results are pretty consistent. One 2012 review pulled together 27 studies looking at this question, and all of them found decreases in relative IQ, resulting in an overall decrease of just about 7 IQ points for living in a fluoridated area relative to a non-poisoned one. Yes, I did say 7. This study has of course been criticized heavily over the years by the pro-fluoridation crowd, but they've been misrepresenting it. In 2018, the New York Times ran an article discussing the study and claimed it only lowered IQ by 0.45 points, linking to this YouTube video. I guess they didn't know that it was not a lowering of 0.45 points, but of 0.45 standard deviations, and given that a standard deviation of IQ is 15, That means a drop of 6.75 points. Since then, at least 15 more studies have looked at the question, and once again, all of them showed a negative association between intelligence metrics and fluoride exposure. Dental fluorosis is also a great indicator of decreased IQ, and let me remind you that over 70% of children and adolescents in the United States suffer from this condition. Critics of these studies also like to say that the amount of fluoride is too high to be relevant in the Western world.
I love this. Well, first of all,
the vast majority of these studies are looking at fluoride levels that are under the EPA or WHO's limits. For example, one study looked at children's intelligence in 2 different villages in China. They looked at their parents' education level, but they were the same between them. They also looked at average family income, but that was the same too. You know what wasn't the same?
You know what? I'm about to say it.
It was the fluoride. They showed a dose-dependent decrease in IQ going from 0.36 parts per million to 4.16 parts per million of fluoride, with the mean IQ dropping over 20 points. 20 points. Let me remind you that the United States' EPA sets the limit at 4.0 parts per million, and that the Scotland study showed dose-dependent increases in dementia risk at well under 0.36 parts per million. They also showed a significantly higher proportion of intellectual disability with increasing fluoride concentrations. Another study looked at prenatal exposure to fluoridated water, and the offspring exhibited a dose-dependent decrease in IQ score. For every half part per million increase in urinary fluoride concentration, a 2.5 point decrease in IQ was predicted. Keep in mind that in North America, the average urinary fluoride for pregnant women is around 1 part per million, but many can have concentrations at well above 2 parts per million, some even getting up to 4 parts per million. Imagine a 10-point decrease in IQ for your child just because the government wants to dump industrial waste into your water and then tell you it's harmless. Remember, the IQ scale is not linear, so if you go from an average IQ of 100 to an IQ of 90, that means a quarter of the population leapfrogged your intelligence.
Well, that was easy.
A 2020 paper looked at a large group of Canadian infants, and this is significant because this country's so-called optimal level of fluoride is just 0.7 parts per million, less than half of what even the WHO recommends. Even this level of fluoride exposure for mothers was associated with a near 10-point drop in performance IQ in their children if they were fed formula with tap water. Public health organizations such as the CDC, American Dental Association, and U.S. Department of Health and Human Services all recommend reconstituting infant formula with this level of optimally fluoridated water. Finally, several analyses have sought to answer the question of how much fluoride could we have in the water without suffering a loss of IQ, with them agreeing that a conservative estimate would put the limit at just above 0.2 parts per million. Considering this, we may be underestimating how much damage fluoride is causing, because there are limited studies analyzing fluoride levels this low. I suspect that the optimal amount of fluoride intake for everyone is absolutely none. So, say what you will. Correlation isn't causation, we need more studies, the data is low quality, whatever. How many more studies will it take if 40 showing a decrease in IQ isn't convincing enough? Truth be told, it'll never be enough for those who don't think it's harmful. Honestly, I get it. It's hard to admit that massive amounts of people have had their potential robbed while big business, media, academia, and government continue to lie. You might not be suffering from Alzheimer's or depression or ADHD or autism as a result of fluoride poisoning, but that's just a part of the issue. Unfortunately, chronic health problems are so common nowadays that many people don't even realize they have them. How many people today have had their development significantly altered due to this? How many people today are walking around in a lower level of consciousness, relying on their reptilian brains? How many more will suffer the consequences? And how will our progression as a species be affected?